Claudia, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much to Claudia and Piers for inviting me to speak today. I'm really looking forward to all of your comments and questions. Today, I will be discussing Spanish artist Victor Patricio Landaluze's fascination with depicting women of mixed Spanish and Afro-Cuban heritage, known within the period as mulatas. A fascination, or one might call obsession, which began in the 1860s and continued throughout the rest of his career. Landaluze's depictions diverge from the typical characterizations of Afro-Cuban women prevalent during this period. Rather, his portrayals of mulata women, such as those seen here, seen here on the left, share extremely strong similarities with Goya's depictions of Spanish Majas, women of lower classes in Madrid, such as seen here on the right. Comparing the work of these two artists demonstrates La Mulata's significance for Landaluze as more than simply a character type, but an expression of his Spanish origins. This talk will explore the complex legacy of Landaluze's fascination with the Cuban mulata and argue for recognizing Landaluze's appropriation and intermixing with Caribbean costumbrismo of Goya's iconography of the Spanish Maja, developed through his print series Los Caprichos. The result produced a female icon who has become one of the most influential images of Cuban identity. By comparing the work of Goya and Landaluze for the first time, I highlight the relationship between the mulata and the Maja as parallel archetypes of femininity, with vital significance to the identities of both Cuba and Spain. Examining Landaluze's mulata alongside Goya's Maja illustrates the visual migration of icons across continents and the evolution of a figure of Spanish nationalism into one of Cuban independence. As a Spanish immigrant in Cuba, Landaluze offers the opportunity to examine a dialogue of imagery and iconography across the Atlantic, as well as the translation of fine art into new traditions that would provide the foundation for modern popular culture. Landaluze undoubtedly, for any of you who might be already familiar with him, has a complicated legacy. Many of his works present negative and caricatured imagery of people of color. Landaluze was a staunch believer that Cuba should remain a Spanish colony, and he worked as an illustrator for pro-Spanish anti-independence newspapers. However, Landaluze was one of the only artists of his time in Cuba who paid attention to or was concerned with representing its Black and mulatto population, which by 1811 made up over 50% of the island. His paintings and prints are among the only remaining records we have of the life and culture of 19th century Afro-Cubans. His prolific output is uncontested as among the most detailed visual documentation of daily life of the period of Africans and Afro-Cubans on the island. The vast majority of Landaluze's work is now housed in the Museo de Bellas Artes de Cuba in Havana, although much is also owned by Cernura Arte Gallery in Miami. And I've been very lucky enough to make trips to see Landaluze's work in both of these places. Landaluze came to Cuba in 1850 and never returned to Spain. He dedicated his career to depicting in prints, watercolors, and paintings all aspects of Cuban life. Born in Bilbao in 1825, he began his artistic development in Madrid. As an aspiring printmaker trained in the Spanish Academy, Landaluze would have been deeply familiar with the legendary Goya and required to copy his work as an essential part of the curriculum of Madrid's Real Academia de San Fernando. After finishing at the Academia, Landaluze left Spain for Mexico and subsequently Cuba, most likely in order to differentiate himself from his peers. Latin America and the Caribbean were perceived as places lacking in artistic talent, and for a young Spanish artist emerging from the academy, an atmosphere in which he could more easily distinguish himself. Landaluze created a wide variety of paintings and prints that attempted to define the many new racial and social types he found in Cuba. Most famous is his series of costumbrista illustrations for the book Tipos y Costumbres de la Isla de Cuba from 1881. Here in the frontispiece, a mulata woman alongside her male counterpart, the calesero, are both prominently displayed along the left side of the frontispiece for Tipos y Costumbres. The book paired Landaluze's illustrations with texts by a variety of Cuban intellectuals. Historian Antonio Bachiller y Morales, the editor of the collection, was persecuted by the Spanish authorities for his public support of racial equality and Cuba's independence. Landaluze's collaboration with Bachiller y Morales departs from the pro-Spanish publications he traditionally illustrated for, and was possibly an opportunity for him to demonstrate a more progressive understanding of Cuban and particularly Afro-Cuban identity. Landaluze's La Mulata del Rumbo, seen here within Tipos y Costumbres, is accompanied by a story by Francisco de Paula Gilabert that begins with describing mulata women as, quote, she in her class, in her sphere, among her own, can be worth as much as any other. But the heterogeneous element that seduces her, that conquests her, that perverts her, is responsible for her faults, for her vices, for her unconcern, end quote. Here, Gilabert equates the mulata's racial heterogeneity with a predisposition towards vice and indulgence, a theme that plays out throughout the rest of the text. In contrast, Landaluze's illustration depicts a mulata woman, within a composition traditionally reserved for upper-class European portraiture. She is elegantly adorned and dressed, gracefully gesturing with her fan, conveying the impression of a woman of refinement to the 19th century viewer who would have understood one's personal character as directly correlated to their physical appearance. Although her pose with her hand in the crook of her waist accentuates her voluptuousness, a trait used to illustrate the mulata's alleged promiscuity, her gaze is not concerned with seducing the viewer, but occupied by something outside of the frame. Combined with her amused expression, Landaluze portrays a woman of agency, whose virtue is not dependent upon the desire of her white male viewer. There is a greater degree of realism in La Mulata del Rumbo than any of Landaluze's other images of mulata women, creating the impression that he invited a real Afro-Cuban woman to pose within his studio as his muse, at least for this individual illustration and possibly for others. The print's caption, La Mulata del Rumbo, rumbo referring to direction or movement, further implies her sense of autonomy and freedom to move throughout Havana, a privilege that in contrast would have been prohibited from most women. Landaluze's image transforms the mulata into a figure who can no longer be easily read and confined. His emphasis on the ambiguity of her position highlights her power as a threat to the strict social boundaries between Black and white, poor and rich, essential to maintaining Spanish authority in Cuba. By depicting a mulata dressed in the splendor of an upper-class Spanish woman, Landaluze reinforces her potency as more than just a beautiful figure for the bourgeois viewer's visual consumption, alluding instead to her ability to actively resist as well as appropriate Spain's imperial culture to her own ends. Landaluze's mulata shares more visual similarities with Goya's Majas than any other female figures produced by his Cuban contemporaries. Goya's Los Caprichos, published in 1799, was Spain's first contemporary satire by an artist of the court and presented an ideal model for Landaluze's own development of caricature of the types he found in Cuba. The Maja was a figure of central importance to Los Caprichos, defined as women of the lower classes in Madrid, who were seen as distinctly Spanish, and emerged as a symbol of Spanish nationalism, especially during the French invasion and occupation of Spain under Napoleon from 1807 to 1814. Goya, like Landaluze, contemplated the figure and significance of the Maja in both prints and paintings, such as his now famous picture, as seen here in the collection at the Hispanic Society, of his patron and muse, the Duchess of Alba, dressed as a Maja. After Los Caprichos, the Maja continued to be a recurring figure in Goya's paintings, becoming an internationally established icon of Spanishness and Spanish femininity that inspires pictures such as Manet's Olympia and reclining young women in Spanish costume. Like mulatas, Majas were also seen as destabilizing figures who threatened Spain's social hierarchy through their ability to make a duchess indistinguishable from a prostitute. The striking resemblance between Landaluze's La Mulata y su Dueña and Goya's print from Los Caprichos, God Forgive Her and It Was Her Mother, suggests that Landaluze's painting was inspired by this very image. The provocative postures of both women are reversed but almost identical. Both hold an open fan up in the air, an arm draped across their torso as they lean backwards to accentuate their figure with a gaze directed at their beholder. Both women expose small dainty feet peeking out from below their dresses, pointed outward to ensure the viewer notices their white high-heeled shoe. This revelation of a woman's foot was understood in both Cuba and Spain as purposeful sexual innuendo. The flower shawl a mantón de Manila, draped over the arms of the mulata, and the mantilla over the head of the Maja indicate that they are in public locations and trespassing beyond their domestic confinements. This brazen defiance of standards of female decorum illustrates both women as willing to directly challenge the machismo culture that traditionally defined both Spain and Cuba. The caption of Goya's print, God Forgive Her and It Was Her Mother, identifies this particular Celestina accompanying the Maja as not simply an elderly woman, but as a mother who prostitutes her daughter. Cuban literature similarly described the mulata's wanton behavior as a hereditary trait of their Afro-Cuban mothers, who writers claimed had seduced their white fathers and trained their daughters to do the same. Like Goya uses the mother who turns away from us, Landaluze uses the dueña to frame and draw attention to the mulata. The dueña in Landaluze's picture is analogously understood as a decaying older woman who offers advice based on her experience as being once young and beautiful herself. While the Celestina turns away from the viewer, covering herself as much as possible with her shawl, the dueña's crudely denoted facial features are almost entirely hidden by her brown tattered shawl, remaining slightly visible in order to further accentuate the mulata's beauty. The connotation of this pairing of younger and older women has led the mulata in Landaluze's painting to often be understood as a prostitute. However, the painting has also been previously titled La Señora y la Serviente de Paseo, the lady and her servant on a walk. The mulata's elegant and luxurious appearance makes her identity as a prostitute further uncertain, blurring the boundaries of class and again emphasizing the ambiguity of the mulata's social position. Landaluze reinforces the mulata's power to appropriate the culture of Cuba's dominant class to her own ends and liberate herself from the transparent appearances that were essential to maintaining Cuba's authority on the island. In other images of mulata women, Landaluze draws parallels between her courtship by the calicero and the Maja's pursuit by her male counterpart, the Majo. In Goya's Even Thus He Cannot Make Her Out, and in Landaluze's The Declaration of Love, The Majo and the Calicero lean forward to closely study the Maja and Mulata, who both coquettishly offer themselves up for inspection. Although Landaluze returns to more racist stereotypes in his depictions of the facial features of the Mulata and the Calicero in this particular watercolor, he highlights between the identical nature of, it makes a highlight between the identical nature of gender relations between Afro-Cubans and Spaniards. Goya's caption suggests that the Majo, despite holding a monocle over his eye, even thus cannot make her out and can never truly understand the Maja, alluding to the danger of her enigmatic character and the Majo's ignorance of the degree of power she is able to have over him. In Landaluze's watercolor, the Mulata's confident smile and her outstretched body that still pulls away ever so slightly also suggest the Mulata's ability to exercise her enchantment and disguise her true intentions. The wide-eyed voyeur behind the Mulata mimics the position of the woman sitting in the background of Goya's print. The expression of Landaluze's voyeur covering his mouth articulates the danger of the Mulata's inscrutable charm, while Goya's caption, even thus he cannot make her out, also warns the viewer about the Maja's deceptions. Landaluze's Fiesta de Carnaval shows a scene of religious festivities outside of Havana. Given the mountains in the background, the location is possibly Guanabacoa, a town outside the city known for its important history with an Afro-Cuban religion of Santeria, and home to the first African cabildo, confraternities founded amongst the African slave population in Cuba, dating back to the 16th century. Landaluze depicts a scene of the carnival festivities the cabildos were allowed by the Spanish authorities to organize once a year. At the right edge of the watercolor, Landaluze depicts a mulata woman in a voluminous light blue gown with a long peach bow in profile, facing a similarly well-dressed man, possibly a calicero, bending over towards her with an outstretched hand. The composition and the figure's positioning in relationship to one another is almost identical to the lecherous advances in Goya's Los Caprichos print, Nobody Knows Himself, a work critical of the hedonism that rampantly overtook Spain's own religious traditions. Goya's print depicts a more blatant sexual advance, emphasized by the bent figure's hand practically touching the Maja skirt, as well as the phallic sword sticking out behind him. Landaluze's replacement of the Maja with a mulata makes direct reference to Goya's print, as well as a comparison between the rampant debauchery present in the superstitions of both Spanish and Afro-Cuban society and religious practice. In Preparándose para la fiesta, or Getting Ready for the Party, Landaluze depicts a mulata woman with a calicero preparing herself for an evening outing. She's beautifully dressed, and the candle on the table in front of her casts a warm glow throughout the room that accentuates the allure of her golden skin. Like the Maja and Goya's two of a kind, the mulata stands in a position almost physically impossible to sustain, displaying her body as sexually attractive to both the calicero and to the viewer. Like their postures in God Forgive Her and It Was Her Mother and Mulata y Su Dueña, both women press their chests out while the bottom half of their bodies lean backwards with an outstretched fan in one hand. The calicero, like the Majo and two of a kind, stands slightly behind but moves towards the mulata, creating a balancing act between their bodies and setting them in visual juxtaposition to one another. They are both positioned as two halves of the same whole, implying a doubled nature to these two pairs that is underscored in Goya's print by his caption, two of a kind. However, the calicero and Maja recede into the background, while the Maja is thrust forward in black and the mulata in bright pink as the central focus of both images. The domestic setting in Preparándose para la Fiesta is identical to Landaluze's watercolor Arreglándose para la Fiesta. Both pictures depict the same woman in her home, possibly one that Landaluze visited in person. Both are intimate portrayals of Mulata woman being observed by the Calicero as she makes herself up before the mirror, but equally studies of the domestic details of the Mulata's household. The mirror tilting forward above the table, the candle lit in the bottle on the wooden dressing table covered with a white cloth, as well as the many objects strewn about the room are duplicated in both pictures, such as the yellow shawl and broom leaning on the wooden chair, illustrating an interest in the minute details of the Mulata's possessions and the interior of her home. Most of the objects in both images, such as the mirror and chair, as well as the open door, are angled to frame the Mulata and the Calicero in the picture's center. The Calicero faces her in both versions, in the painting standing behind her, and in the watercolor moving across the room to sit in front of her, as if Landaluze was testing out his role and placement in the scene. By depicting the Mulata in a pastoral domestic setting in a way that Goya does not, Landaluze considers her identity beyond an inhabitant of the streets. In a manner similar to the Maja's popularity as a symbol of Spanish nationalism, Mulata women by the end of the 19th century and the height of Cuba's fight for independence from Spain had also been converted into figures of patriotism. The Mulata's ambiguity as neither fully European nor African, Spanish nor Hispanic embodies Cuba's cultural uniqueness, as well as the future of the racially transformed island. Mulata women became the inspiration for a generation of 20th century Cuban artists and writers attempting to find Cuban nationalism, such as Victor Manuel's La Gitana Tropical, painted in Paris in 1929. Intriguing here is Manuel's decision, which I'm happy to go into further in the Q&A, to title his painting here, of a Cuban Mulata woman, La Gitana Tropical, the tropical gypsy. Later in the 20th century, Cuban poet, literary critic, and cultural leader, Roberto Retamar, wrote in his famous Caliban, Notes Toward a Discussion of Our Culture in America, that the Mulata was the embodiment of Jose Marti's Nuestra America Mestizo, and Cuba's racial hybridity as the essence of the island's identity. In conclusion, I want to turn briefly to our own historical moment. The Mulata has been reincarnated in the 21st century through brands such as Ron Mulata or Mulata Rum as the personification of Cuba's tropical leisure and beauty, essential to the tourism industry, crucial to the island's economic survival. Mulata Rum advertises the Mulata as representing the fire, the happiness, and the mysticism of Cuba, quoting Cuban poet Nicolás Guillén that Cuba sabe que es mulata, or Cuba knows it's mulata, confirming the identity of the island as intertwined with its mixed race Spanish heritage. And actually this Mulata rum is a brand that has existed since the late 19th century, early 20th century. Europe's enthrallment with the Maja's personification of Spanishness and the country's sensual allure is mirrored in Spain's own fascination with the Cuban mulata. Both women could not have been transformed into the infamous international symbols and prototypes of femininity that they are now without Goya or Landaluze's masterful imagery. Thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions.